Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back on my YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to learn English proverbs. Uyu munsi wa none tugiye kwiga imigani yo mu rurimi rw'Icyongereza. Niba utarakora subscribe, like, share ndetse na comment, bikore nonaha mbere yuko dutangira. Proverb ya mbere dufite ni when you lose what you want, you take what you see. When you lose what you want, you take what you see. Iyo ubuze icyo ushaka, ufata icyo ubonye. When you lose what you want, you take what you see. Iyo ubuze icyo ushaka, ufata icyo ubonye. Kabiri, when you miss the bus, you walk. When you miss the bus, you walk. Iyo bisi igusize, ugenda n'amaguru. When the door closes, you find another way. When the door closes, you find another way. Iyo umuryango ufunze, ushaka indi nzira. Kane, when you fall, you stand up again. When you fall, you stand up again. Iyo uguye, urongera ugahaguruka. Gatanu, when you fail, you try again. When you fail, you try again. Iyo utsinzwe, urongera ukagerageza. When you are hungry, you look for food. When you are hungry, you look for food. Iyo ushonje, ushaka ibyo kurya. Karindwi, when you are thirsty, you drink water. When you are thirsty, you drink water. Iyo ufite inyota, unywa amazi. When you are tired, you rest. When you are tired, you rest. Iyo unaniwe, uraruhuka. When you lose money, you work more. When you lose money, you work more. Iyo utakaje amafaranga, ukora cyane. When the road is hard, you walk slowly. When the road is hard, you walk slowly. Iyo inzira ikomeye, ugenda buhoro cyangwa se umuhanda. When you see a chance, you take it. When you see a chance, you take it. Iyo ubonye amahirwe, urayafata. When people laugh, you smile. When people laugh, you smile. Iyo abantu baseka, uramwenyura. When it rains, you find shelter. When it rains, you find shelter. Iyo imvura iguye, ushaka ubwugamo. When the light goes off, you use a candle. When the light goes off, you use a candle. I'll repeat one more time. When the light goes off, you use a candle. Iyo umuriro ubuze, ukoresha buji. When you are late, you hurry. When you are late, you hurry. Iyo watinze, urihuta cyangwa se iyo wakerewe, urihuta. When you run, you grow. When you run, you grow. When you learn, you grow. Iyo wiga, urakura. Mu bumenyi. When you listen, you understand. When you listen, you understand. Iyo uteze amatwi, urasobanukirwa. When you work, you earn. When you work, you earn. Iyo ukoze, urinjiza. When you help others, they thank you. When you help others, they thank you. Iyo ufasha abandi, baragushimira. When you see danger, you learn. When you see danger, you learn. Iyo ubonye akaga, wiruka. When you save money, you feel safe. When you save money, you feel safe. Iyo uzigama amafaranga, wumva utekanye. When you speak kindly, people like you. When you speak kindly, people like you. Iyo uvuga neza, abantu baragukunda. When you practice, you improve. When you practice, you improve. Iyo witoza, urushaho kuba mwiza cyangwa se kwiteza imbere. Zikotora. When you read, you learn new things. When you read, you learn new things. Iyo usomye, wiga ibintu byinshi cyangwa se iyo usoma, wiga ibintu byinshi. When you ask, you get answers. When you ask, you get answers. Iyo ubaza, ubona ibisubizo. Iyo ubaza, ubona ibisubizo. When you share, everyone is happy. When you share, everyone is happy. Iyo usangira, buri umwe wese arishima cyangwa se aba yishimye. When you wake up early, you do more. When you wake up early, you do more. Iyo ubyutse kare, ukora byinshi. When you wait, you become patient. When you wait, you become patient. Iyo utegereje, uba umuntu wihangana cyangwa se umuntu ugira kwihangana. When you forgive, your heart is free. When you forgive, your heart is free. Iyo ubabariye, umutima wawe urabohoka. When you try, you may succeed. When you try, you may succeed. Iyo ugerageje, ushobora gutsinda. Second section, agace ka kabiri. When you work hard, you succeed. Iyo ukoze cyane, uratsinda. When you work hard, you succeed. Iyo ukoze cyane, uratsinda. When you wake up early, the day is long. When you wake up early, the day is long. Iyo ubyutse kare, umunsi uba muremure. When you walk slowly, you arrive safely. When you walk slowly, you arrive safely. Iyo ugenda buhoro, ugerayo amahoro. When you respect others, they respect you. When you respect others, they respect you. Iyo wubaha abandi, nabo barakubaha. When you speak the truth, you have peace. When you speak the truth, you have peace. Iyo uvuga ukuri, ugira amahoro. Iyo uvuga ukuri, ugira amahoro. When you plant a seed, it grows. When you plant a seed, it grows. Iyo uteye urubuto, rurakura. When you learn every day, you become wise. When you learn every day, you become wise. Iyo wiga buri munsi, uba umunyabwenge. When you save little by little, you become rich. When you save little by little, you become rich. Iyo wizigama buhoro buhoro, uba umukire. N'iyo wize buhoro buhoro, birangira ubimenye. Niyo mpamvu, niba utarakora subscribe, ukaba uri kureba iyi video, yikande nonaha, like, share ndetse na comment. When you help the poor, God blesses you. When you help the poor, God blesses you. Iyo ufasha abakene, Imana iguha umugisha. When you help the poor, God blesses you. Ikurikira ni, when you listen well, you understand more. When you listen well, you understand more. Iyo uteze amatwi neza, urushaho gusobanukirwa. When you start well, you finish well. When you start well, you finish well. Iyo utangiye neza, urangiza neza. Cyangwa se, iyo ukoze neza, usoza neza, ku itangiriro. When you wait patiently, good things come. When you wait patiently, good things come. Iyo utegereje wihanganye, ibyiza biraza. When you share food, friendship grows. When you share food, friendship grows. Iyo musangira ibiryo, ubucuti burakura cyangwa se buriyongera. When you smile, people feel happy. When you smile, people feel happy. Iyo umwenyura, abantu barishima. When you read books, your mind grows. When you read books, your mind grows. Iyo usoma ibitabo, ubwenge bwawe burakura cyangwa se buriyongera. When you ask questions, you learn faster. When you ask questions, you learn faster. Iyo ubaza ibibazo, wiga vuba. Iyo ubaza ibibazo, wiga vuba. When you keep trying, you win one day. When you keep trying, you win one day. Iyo ukomeje kugerageza, umunsi umwe uratsinda. When you forgive, your heart becomes light. When you forgive, your heart becomes light. Iyo ubabariye, umutima wawe uroroha. Light ni ikintu kitaremereye. Gusa hari na light y'urumuri, ntimuze kubyitiranya. When you follow good advice, life becomes easier. When you follow good advice, life becomes easier. Iyo ukurikije inama nziza, ubuzima buroroha cyane. When you see a problem, look for a solution. When you see a problem, look for a solution. Iyo ubonye ikibazo, ushaka igisubizo. Cyangwa se iyo ubonye ikibazo, ushaka igisubizo. When you are honest, people trust you. When you are honest, people trust you. Iyo uri inyangamugayo, abantu barakwizera. When you work together, work becomes easy. When you work together, work becomes easy. Iyo mukoranye, akazi karoroha, cyangwa se iyo ukoranye n'abandi, akazi karoroha. When you respect time, you finish early. When you respect time, you finish early. Iyo wubashye igihe, usoza kare. When you think before speaking, you avoid problems. When you think before speaking, you avoid problems. Iyo utekereza mbere yo kuvuga, wirinda ibibazo. When you teach others, you learn more. When you teach others, you learn more. Iyo wigisha abandi, wiga byinshi. Uko niko kuri. When you give love, you receive love. When you give love, you receive love. Iyo utanze urukundo, wakira urukundo. When you stay calm, you think better. When you stay calm, you think better. Hano ntabwo dusoma calm, dusoma calm. Calm. Iyo utuje, utekereza neza. When you stay calm, you think better. Iyo utuje, utekereza neza. When you choose good friends, life is better. When you choose good friends, life is better. Iyo uhisemo inshuti nziza, ubuzima burushaho kuba bwiza. When you do good, good comes back. Iyo ukora ibyiza, ibyiza birakugarukira. When you breathe in yourself, you become strong. When you breathe in yourself, you become strong. Iyo wiyizereramo, urakomera. When you breathe in yourself, you become strong. Iyo wiyizereramo, urakomera. Thank you for watching this video. Like, subscribe, share and comment.